Hello, welcome to Walk in the Park. My name is Tony Ingram, and this week is episode 104, recorded on May 20th, 2015. You can see all my episodes at that website below, walkinpark.com, which is my video blog or vid blog, I like to call it sometimes. So, yeah, check that out. This week we're going to go to Watkins Glen State Park, but we're going to look at it from a perspective that you may not have ever heard of before, from an artistic perspective. And I'm going to call this probably Hope Comes to Rainbow Falls, something like that. So let's go right over to Watkins Glen State Park. Here's a aerial photograph by my friend Bill Hecht, who is a photographer, and he loves to get up in airplanes and take photographs. The lake is Seneca Lake. The village in the lower right is Watkins Glen, the village of Watkins Glen. And then the ravine in the lower left, that is the state park, Watkins Glen State Park, with the gorge running right through it. And Watkins Glen, or the village of Watkins Glen and the gorge, was named after Samuel Watkins, who was actually born in a cemetery. If you look on the gorge there, the lower left, just up above it, there's actually a cemetery there, and his gravestone is in there. And he organized the village from several small hamlets back in the early 1800s and passed away in 1851. And he owned the gorge. He owned that was Watkins Glen, Watkins Gorge. He owned it, and he had some mills in there. He had a couple of mills in the main entrance, what's now called the main entrance, the entrance to the gorge downtown. This was an old plaster mill that was there, and he had another grist mill, and there were one or two other mills farther up the valley, I believe. Here's a artist's depiction by an artist named Frances Faucet that lives in Ithaca, and she did this for a park exhibit that we put in at the park when I used to work there years ago. Worked for all the Finger Lakes State Parks. And that shows this long flume, they call it, a trough of water coming out of the gorge. There's a hole in the through a cliff and a dam behind the bend that dammed up a little lake they called Stillwater. And here's an actual photograph of that flume trough as it came out of the gorge, and it powered that mill. So it went over a big overshot wheel inside the mill. So Watkins died in 1851, and a man named George Freer, who was a local judge, had the good fortune to marry Watkins's widow, and therefore he inherited his property. Because back then, I guess women didn't keep their husbands, or their widows didn't keep their husband's property if they remarried. So going up to Women's Rights National Historical Park and learn more about that, I guess. But here's a picture of the mill in the 1860s after it ceased operating. But before the park got going, it wasn't really a park then, but before it became a tourist attraction. And you can see also, though, that the flume is now gone, because it would have come right from where about we would be standing, or the photographer was standing. The mill had a fire at some point. I think by 1870 or so, it had been torn down. So we're going to now take a sidestep to some of the things that were going on in landscape history back then. In the old days, the original decades and centuries of America, the landscape was seen in utilitarian terms, and also the wilderness was seen as a place of evil and danger and to be conquered. But that changed in the 19th century with people like Henry David Thoreau and the Transcendentalists, and also the Hudson River School of Painters. Now, this is a painting by a guy named Asher Durant, who was well, not exactly a student, but he was a younger age painter than the guy in this picture on the left on the ledge is Thomas Cole, who is considered the father of the Hudson River School of Painting. It's a not actual school, but a tradition that became very popular in the mid and later part of the 19th century for maybe 50, 60 years. It was, if you wanted to be a great painter at that time, you painted landscapes. So he loved the Hudson River area. This is a stylized painting showing several elements over in the Catskill Mountains. And the man to his right is William Cullen Bryant, a poet. And this painting was actually painted by Asher Durant, 1849, a year after Thomas Cole died. Well, Thomas Cole's only real student was this man, Frederick Church, who became one of the most famous Hudson River School painters and actually made a living at it. And he had some other occupations and so forth. And he built this fantastic mansion in a sort of Middle Eastern style, because he traveled in the Middle East, on the other side of the river from the Catskills. And it was called Olana, so you can go visit it in the Olana State Historic Site, and it's a really neat place to go. And he painted many, many landscapes all across the country, all around the world, South America, the Andes, many places, Europe, and was one of the most famous Hudson River School painters. So well, now we're going to go back to Watkins Glen, and remember George Freer had inherited the Glen, or didn't inherit it, but he got it through marriage. And this man showed up in town in the early 1860s, maybe late 1850s, and he fell in love with the Glen. His name was Morvalden Els, not somebody you're likely to know outside of Schuyler County. But he was a journalist in Elmira, originally from Connecticut, and he knew a lot about scenic or nature tourism in places like Niagara Falls, especially places that had scenic grandeur, the White Mountains, the Catskills, the Adirondacks, Mammoth Cave, and even in the west and so forth, some of the that was later, a little bit later with Yosemite and Yellowstone. But he knew that those places were big attractions for the wealthy, and people who could travel and could actually take vacations were taking trains and steamboats and so forth to these wonderful locations, and artists and writers and so forth would go there. So there's this tribute to Morvalden Els, opened this book of nature July 4th, 1863, as a private enterprise, now Watkins Glen State Park, one of the scenic wonders of the world. Well, he persuaded George Freer to let him open this up, and that first season they had 8,000 visitors, which was quite a lot. And notice that July 4th, 1863 was actually right in the middle of the Battle of Gettysburg, but they didn't have CNN back then, so they didn't know that was going on probably. So he put in, he and his workmen, he designed walkways, wooden walkways to replace the crude Miller's walkways. Originally it was called Mill Creek, and the Millers had crude walkways up in there to get to their waterworks and so forth. Here's a looking back from the wooden stair entrance and walkway back at the mill before it was gone. And here's another picture of the mill before it was gone by 1870 or so. But look at the people in the lower part of the picture. They are dressed in Victorian dress of tourists, not of obviously local farmers and millers and laborers and so forth. So while the mill still stood there, the transition to a tourist attraction was already taking place. Here's an early drawing of the village of Watkins Glen at that time back in the 1800s, and steamboats on the lake, and then a couple of the waterfalls that are up in the Glen that attract people. So this was from a tourist publication. And a lot of publications were written, a lot of brochures, postcards, articles. It was sort of an explosion at this time of mass media, particularly newspapers and magazines. And that is kind of like the explosion of the internet now. And people started to learn about places like Watkins Glen. This is from a visualization from the air, which they couldn't have possibly had, of course, before airplanes, of looking down at Watkins Glen, steamboats on Seneca Lake coming in on the right, and on the left is the gorge, and there's hotels and so forth there, including the 3-story Glen Mountain House, which was built on the south side of the gorge, and was there for about 30 years or so, 1872 till approximately 1902 when it burned down, just before the creation of the state park. So here's a Currier and Ives print showing a scene from the gorge looking up at a bridge built across the gorge in 1872, which is still there. The Iron Bridge, they originally call it. Now they call it the Suspension Bridge. And the Glen Mountain House Hotel is on the right. And on the left is a building that was built before that, originally called the Glen Mountain House, but once they built the hotel, they switched the name to the building on the right. And the building on the left is the Swiss Chalet, they call it. And they had souvenirs and postcards and snacks. And also they had a kitchen. and they cooked the food for the dining room in the hotel and took it across that bridge. So, so the tourism got going, and by 1872, it was really cooking along. A hotel was built, the bridge was built, and things were happening. Well, now we're going to take a little detour that will come right back around here to this gentleman, Captain James Hope. Captain James Hope was from Vermont, and he was an artist originally, and he studied landscape art. He was influenced by the Hudson River School of Painters, and then he was joined the I don't know whether we did it on purpose or not, but anyway, he was part of the Union Army. He was from a regiment from Vermont, and he's one of a few professional artists that were in the Army. And this is the only painting, I think, of the Grand Army of the Potomac. I don't know exactly where it's located here. Maybe it's on the Potomac, but this was the big Union Army, and this is one of his most famous paintings. It's hanging in the let's see, where is that? That's hanging in a museum in Boston. So let me get to the name of that. That's whoops. Yeah, that's the Boston Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, of course. Okay, sorry. Then here's a close-up showing this cavalry, group of cavalry here, line of cavalry, which is in the lower center of this picture. It's just sort of a neat detail. It's really quite a lot of detail in this painting. And then he was at the number of battles, and he did sketches while he was at the battles. And this is the Battle of Antietam, which is one of the bloodiest battles of the war. Aftermath of Bloody Lane, this one's called. The end of the day, looking across Bloody Lane, the center of Lee's defensive line, an 800-yard-long sunken road, later called Bloody Lane, as it appeared following the midday battle. By 1 p.m., some 5,000 killed and wounded troops of both sides lay along this farm road. So so he was up on the hill looking at all this, and he painted a number of pictures of the Battle of Antietam, one of the bloodiest, as I say, of the Civil War. And actually, this painting is at the Antietam National Battlefield site in Maryland. So let's get back to Frederick Church here. James Hope met Frederick Church, and undoubtedly, and James Hope started a studio in New York City, and he was greatly influenced by him and other Hudson River School painters. Of course, Frederick Church was known for really incredible work. This is his view of Niagara Falls, and from the American side, looking towards the American Falls and Horseshoe Falls. So pretty cool. But James Hope then, after the war, his studio work was declining. He wasn't really making a living there, so he decided to retire, and he came to Watkins Glen, and he set up an art studio. Now, if you look at this little map, this is the area of the hotels and what have you, and in the lower center, that dark gray area crossing, that is the actual stream and gorge depicted, and just below that is a building, which is the old Glen Mountain House Hotel, and above it is the Swiss Chalet, or North Glen Mountain House. And then you look to the left, and just out of the picture there, you can see a little sort of L-shaped building, and it says Hope's Gallery. It's partially cut off there. He set up an art gallery there and became the resident artist. And this is looking from the end of the bridge towards his gallery, and then going around towards his gallery, and the other side of his gallery, and looking back, you can see it says Art Gallery, and there's a little gazebo there. But in the back, there is that is the Swiss Chalet. And here's a painting in 1873 he made from the deck on his, the doorway or deck of his art gallery, looking back at the Swiss Chalet, obviously in winter. And there you can see the Iron Bridge, which is still there today. There's another picture looking back again from the end of the bridge and the Swiss Chalet towards his art gallery. And there was actually some people in there, but it's kind of a fuzzy picture. So an old poster, Glen Art Gallery, the Hope's celebrated painting of Rainbow Falls, and also, which he sold for $10,000. and his Army of the Potomac. So he had his Civil War paintings right there at Watkins Glen in his studio, stored there in his art gallery and studio for many years. And they actually, wasn't until well until the 20th century that the National Park Service got a hold of them. They were not in very good shape. There was a flood in 1935 that destroyed much of his work, and so the National Park Service restored some of those paintings. So let's get back to Morval and Els. And Morval and Els, he had come in, well, like I said, he opened up the place in the early 1860s, had been around for a while, and he started to write a guidebook which was published by the owner of the Glen Mountain House Hotel. And so his name actually, Morval and Els' name is not actually in this edition of the guidebook, but it's the same words that he had in earlier versions. And in it were amazing drawings of the various features of the gorge, including Rainbow Falls, which is one of the two waterfalls you can walk behind. And look at those staircases climbing up behind Rainbow Falls, getting up towards the gorge. And things have changed a lot since then. But here is one of his paintings of Rainbow Falls. This one, I believe, is hanging in the, this may be the one that's in the Watkins Glen Public Library. I think maybe they have another one at the Schuyler County Historical Society Museum in Montour Falls. And then here's another painting of a scene in the Glen that he did. And there's another famous one. This one is called Frowning Cliff. It's farther up in the gorge beyond Rainbow Falls. And there's actually a bridge right in the center of it, and that's the bridge that you would look down on Rainbow Falls at from the upstream side. This belongs to the Arnott Art Museum in Elmira, and it was recently loaned to the Rockwell Museum in Corning, but they probably have it back by now. So go back and look at the art gallery again. You can see some people now down there gathered by the gazebo. And what do we have here? Let's see. Two tourists, Glen Mountain House, Watkins Glen, all these different things. Now here in the picture you can see the Swiss Chalet on the left, the Iron Bridge, and the Glen Mountain House. Postcards you could buy in Hope Souvenir Shop. Now here's a real interesting picture. Now this is a stereograph. A lot of these pictures I've got are actually one side of a stereograph, and back in those days it was very popular for photographers to set up two cameras next to each other and take pictures slightly offset so that when you look through a stereo viewer, which you could buy or borrow or whatever, you get a 3D image. It's kind of like the old Viewmasters we had when we were kids. Not so common now, though I guess you can get stuff online with it. But what's really interesting to me, however, is that the name on the left-hand side, C. Bierstadt, photographer. Well, Charles Bierstadt lived in Niagara Falls. He was originally born in Prussia, and I think he grew up in Bedford, Massachusetts, or something like that. And it's actually his brother who is more famous, but he was a quite successful, successful stereographic photographer. Here is another, this has a seal in the back of the card, another of his stereographs of looking that picture, that same picture of looking from Hope's Gallery down to the Swiss Chalet. Well, he also went around the country to places like Yosemite National Park and Yellowstone and other places that were of great scenic interest. That's El Capitan, the most famous cliff in America probably, then in Yosemite. But his brother Albert Bierstadt is much better known, and there is one of his paintings from Yosemite National Park. And Albert Bierstadt is one of the great Hudson River School painters, and I think even the White House has it might be this one or one of the other, I guess it's a Bierstadt painting they have there. And here is a painting that Albert Bierstadt, who I think also lived in Niagara Falls, of the American Falls. So, James Hope lived from, he was at Watkins Glen from 1872 until he passed away in 1892. But his son, James D. Hope, and I don't have any picture of him right now, was a quite accomplished photographer, and he continued Hope's gallery, James Hope's gallery and gift shop in the resort for quite some time, and here and well into the 20th century, and after it became a state park in 1906, in fact. And here is one of the guidebooks, and I believe these are his photographs, black and white photographs of Rainbow Falls. And you look on the left there, well, here's one they colorized, as sold as a postcard, and the waterfall is coming down on the left. Lower right is a waterfall called Triple Cascade, and the staircase is called the Flying Stairs. They're made of concrete with iron pipe railings, of the same design that actually was built at Niagara Falls. It was quite intentional to mimic Niagara Falls, which was ripped out in large part in a flood in 1935 and was replaced with the current stonework. So, so going back to James Hope's painting here, well, that's given when people do still paint in places like Watkins Glen, but many more people do photography. So here is one of the photographs I've taken, but there are many, many wonderful photographs out there. Probably, well, between this and Cavern Cascade, according to the rangers, is the most photographed place in Watkins Glen. Here's looking from the other side. And now, it's called Rainbow Falls, but where's the rainbow? Well, actually, I knew a ranger that worked there for many years, and he would get off, I think, like about 4 o'clock every day. And he told me that he had never seen the rainbow because he was always off. And it turns out that and I hadn't seen it for many years either, because I worked over at Teganic Falls and would go over to Watkins fairly often, but usually not that time, but later in the day when the sun would set down in the western end of the gorge, because the gorge runs from west to east, and the sun would set right down through the gorge and shine on the falls. So here we are. Finally, eventually, I stayed around long enough to go see the rainbow in the falls. It's not a big rainbow. It doesn't compare to Rainbow Falls at Niagara Falls, but it has a very sweet little rainbow. And so it became known as Rainbow Falls. And here's a picture I took on a very hot day, more than 10 years ago. And in fact, Rainbow Falls is on the cover of my book, A Walk Through Watkins Glen, Waters, Sculpture, and Stone. In fact, I will show you, here's my book right here, Walk Through Watkins Glen, Waters, Sculpture, and Stone, which they do make available in the gift shop and so forth. But I'm going to read from it in a second, because Rainbow Falls became very famous a lot from travel writers and photographers and artists, but one in particular was very interesting to run across. In fact, I searched for it for a long time, was comment by this gentleman who was living at Elmira in the 1860s, Samuel Clemens, better known as Mark Twain. So in Mark Twain, he mentioned Rainbow Falls in a book he wrote called Roughing It. It was a travel book, basically, written in or at least published in 1871. And so I found a quote. I found it actually in the Schuyler County Historical Museum, and I confirmed it with the Watkins Glen, not the Watkins, the Mark Twain Quarry Farm people at Elmira College. So here's what he wrote about Rainbow Falls, published in 1871. If one desires to be so stirred by a poem of nature, wrought in the happily commingled graces of picturesque rocks, glimpsed distances, foliage, color, shifting lights and shadows, and falling water, that the tears almost come into his eyes, so potent is the charm exerted, he need not go away from America to enjoy such an experience. The Rainbow Fall in Watkins Glen on the Erie Railway is an example. It would recede into pitiable insignificance if the callous tourist drew an arithmetic on it, but left to compete for the honors simply on scenic grace and beauty, the grand, the august, and the sublime being barred the contest, it could challenge the old world and the new to produce its peer. So clearly, Mark Twain was very impressed by this sweet little waterfall. So, yeah. Now the gorge is probably open by now, so you can get up there and see Rainbow Falls, walk behind it, and enjoy it. Now we're going to take another. I had a couple more minutes here, so we're going to go somewhere else very close to Watkins Glen. Look at this is the aerial visualization satellite composite picture of the land between the lakes, between Seneca Lake and Cayuga Lake, and Watkins Glen would be the lower left, the bottom of Seneca Lake. And then notice the pin there is Finger Lakes National Forest. Well, I was up there with a friend last Sunday. Here is Finger Lakes National Forest. It's said to have been, at least has been, maybe still is, the smallest national forest. It's only about 16,000 acres, which for state lands would be a lot, but not for federal national forest lands. Here is an angled view looking at where it is between the lakes, and it's on what's called the Hector Backbone. And the Hector Backbone is a gentle rise ridge between Cayuga Lake and Seneca Lake, separating them, separating their watersheds. And it runs, the Finger Lakes National Forest runs along that Hector Backbone ridge. And there are trails there. Recreation is one of the highest priorities there. So there's some nice trails. There's in the middle there on the right, you might be able to read that it says the Burnt Hill Trail, and just that yellow one in the exact center there, that is the Interlocking Trail, which goes up through most of the park. So I went over there with my friend Kevin, and we went on the Burnt Hill Trail, which goes out over a mixture of fields and woods. And there's a lot of grazing that goes on there. There's an area that's maintained for blueberries, they call Blueberry Patch, and it's very lovely. So looking east towards the Cayuga Lake Valley, Cayuga Lake watershed, and then over some of the fields, through the woods. On the Interlocking Trail here, we crossed over and went on that. Cross pasture. There is a apple tree out in the middle of pasture. Looking west now into the Seneca Lake watershed. I'm not sure whether you can see the lake there or not. Into the woods. There's Kevin on a boardwalk. It was pretty wet in some places. Interlocking Trail. He's down looking at some wildflowers, including this one, which is mayapple. Big waxy inch-wide blossom that will produce a fruit later in the summer, which some say you can eat. If you eat them too early, it'll make you sick, I understand. And starflower, not seen all that commonly. And then the feathery stuff there, that's lycopodium, or creeping ground cedar. And some pink azalea about to bloom. Finally back to, there's a small campground there. Well, that's all we have time for today. So I want to thank you for joining me, and have a good week.